Recently, the CMA, UK's regulatory agency that looks at acquisitions, asked any interested parties to send in their input towards the deal. I took the chance to send them my thoughts. I focused more on Sony and how they have a market-dominant monopoly position and are working with regulators to maintain their monopoly. I am going to read through what I sent to the CMA in this video. After I sent that to the CMA, the EU also weighed in and has gone to Phase 2. I will give some additional thoughts on the EU's concerns after going through what I sent to the CMA. Here's what I sent to the CMA. Hello. I'd like to give my perspective on the Microsoft ABK merger. My viewpoint will focus more on how Sony has monopolized the video game industry and are now trying to protect that monopoly. To look at the gaming industry, you have to look at the history of how we got here. The industry started with many competitors and offered many options for the consumer. This was a great time for gamers. Competition drove the creation of many different gaming experiences that platforms would use to drive customers to their ecosystem. With good competition, we had new ways of playing, different controller styles, different types of games, and price competition. We had many competitors throughout the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. Enter Sony. Once Sony decided to enter the market, they decided to use Sony's vast financial resources to foreclose all the competitors in the space. When they entered the market, the video game console landscape included platforms like Neo Geo, Panasonic's 3DO, NEC's TurboGrafx-16, Atari's Jaguar, Commodore's Amiga, Nintendo with the SNES and N64, and Sega with the Genesis and Dreamcast. Sony went after most of the studios and publishers making games and paid them to make games for their platform, starving the other consoles of content. Sony also acquired one of the largest publishers in Europe at the time in Psygnosis, based in the UK, among many other acquisitions. Within a few years, they managed to foreclose all of their competitors. By the end of the decade, the only platform remaining was PlayStation. The N64 was struggling, Sega pulled out of the market but remained as a game publisher. The others left the market or went bankrupt. Nintendo tried once again with the GameCube and again failed. Nintendo was able to weather the storm from Sony because it still made a compelling handheld with the Game Boy and the eventual DS series. This allowed them to continue trying. Others weren't so lucky. Nintendo was able to try something different to attack the market from a different angle by releasing the Wii. This allowed them to create a family-friendly gaming platform, and contrary to the insulting claims by Sony, Nintendo is very much a gaming company and continues to release top-quality games on their platform, including the mega franchises of Pokemon, Zelda, and Mario, among others. Their current platform, Nintendo Switch, is one of the best-selling consoles of all time, but yet is still unable to compete with Sony. Sony still continues to dominate the gaming world, and Nintendo is relegated to indie titles and their own superb first-party catalog. Sony's own arrogance and eventual market consolidation towards their current monopoly position is what drove Microsoft to enter the gaming console market. In fears that PlayStation could eventually compete with Windows, Microsoft entered the market with the Xbox. At first, with the threat perceived to be real, Microsoft heavily invested, using Sony's own tactics against them. Buying studios, money-heading third-party games away from PlayStation, Xbox was on its way to competing well against PlayStation. Xbox did a pretty good job with its second console, the Xbox 360, but still wasn't able to topple PlayStation or Nintendo Wii, coming in last place again. The perceived threat of PlayStation taking out Windows turned out to not be an issue. Other market forces became much more of a threat to Windows, specifically mobile with iOS and Android. Microsoft shifted away focus from Xbox, keeping it on life support instead of competing in the market. With this shift, Sony had clear runway to extend their current monopoly position. Outside the US market, PlayStation enjoys a healthy monopoly across the globe. In the US market, it has remained about 50-50 with PlayStation and Xbox, though PlayStation has the larger market share over Xbox even in the US. In the rest of the world, PlayStation can enjoy close to 100% market share, the average being around 95+%. The UK is one of the better markets for Xbox, though still with a significantly lower market share to PlayStation. With the dominance across the globe, PlayStation is a de facto monopoly, having over 70% market share globally, and if you take the US market out, over 85% market share globally. A question should arise looking at why Nintendo should not be considered as a rival, and therefore their market share taken into consideration when looking at PlayStation's market share. The problem is that Sony destroyed them so badly that Nintendo doesn't want to compete for the same market space as them. Hence, little to none of the large AAA games, the equivalent of blockbuster movies, are on Nintendo's platform. This is disappointing, but it is understandable. Sony is much larger than Nintendo, and they can't compete with their go-to-market strategy of locking down games to their own platform. This makes it challenging for Nintendo to make a console with enough power, selling it at a loss, as they may not make it back with the game sales of third-party AAA games through their store. It would be great for the market if Nintendo could come back stronger, or be allowed to by some legislation and regulation, into the market to give consumers some competitive options. However, unless there is some regulatory or legislative relief, it is unlikely that this can happen. Until such relief is available, Nintendo doesn't have access to games like Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed, many of the Tom Clancy games, many of the EA Sports games, Grand Theft Auto, Elden Ring, Gotham Knights, and many more. The large games aren't on that platform. With this, essentially, Sony ends up owning the market. All of those games come to PlayStation. Many games don't come to Xbox either, especially Japanese games. PlayStation's network effect is too strong to allow anyone to realistically compete unless they acquire a significant library of games to acquire customers. Now let's look at Sony and acquisitions. As the worldwide monopoly in console gaming, it is again disappointing that Sony is allowed to continue acquiring more and more studios with almost no scrutiny. At some point, it would be helpful for the regulatory agencies to look at Sony and stop them from continuing to monopolize the console space. The network effect of Sony is self-perpetuating. All publishers and studios have a vested interest in putting their games on PlayStation, as it is available throughout most of the world. Xbox barely exists outside of the US market, making it a difficult platform to target, and as detailed, Nintendo doesn't want to compete with Sony or Xbox on power, so few if any AAA games target the platform. With Sony continuing to add more and more first-party content, Sony continues to solidify its market position, making it almost impossible for anyone else to enter the space. Many new entrants are trying to come into the market in a way that takes advantage of their strengths instead of trying to compete with Sony. Cloud access is one of those options. The other is PC. That market has a handful of stores, Epic, GOG, Steam, Microsoft, etc., that allow consumers and developers to have some level of competition. Cloud has its own adoption issues with global network infrastructure not up to the levels needed to make that a general reality. This market may grow, or may be supplanted by something else in the future. Another major industry shift is coming from mobile. In this space, we already have a duopoly, with Apple and Google being the main publishers of all mobile games. At least we have some new players in the market, but this is also a new area of concern, as we really don't have much competition in this space either. Microsoft, to its credit, has recently decided that exiting the gaming industry would be detrimental to both the industry and to Microsoft. With the renewed focus and investment, Microsoft's Xbox brand is now looking to compete against the Sony monopoly. This is fantastic for gamers. It has given rise to a new way to access games in Game Pass. It has brought better backwards compatibility to allow for potentially better game preservation. It has pushed cloud technology into games, cloud-powered elements within games played on local hardware, and is looking to push the industry forward with the potential to take your games with you via cloud access from any screen. Along with this, Xbox has been promoting cross-play, which is playing the same game across multiple platforms, cross-buy, purchase it once, play it on multiple platforms, cross-progression, play anywhere and sync your current progress in the game, and Sony has had to respond to these market pressures based on customer demand, even though they fully enjoy a monopoly position. One of Sony's responses to Xbox is to block games from competitors such as Stadia Pro, Game Pass, Luna, and other subscription-based services. As the monopoly they are, studios and publishers bend the knee and block themselves from those platforms. Again, disappointing that regulatory agencies don't intervene in this kind of behavior from Sony. Imagine if Warner came in and forced other companies to not work with Netflix. This is what Sony is doing right now. They also allegedly charge a crossplay tax on publishers in case the publisher wants their game to allow players across communities, mobile, PC, or console, to play together. These practices, again, hamper the experience for the consumer. Even now, major titles come out without crossplay on PlayStation because of this non-consumer friendly practice by Sony. There are plenty of other anti-consumer moves that Sony has made. Cloud saves, the backup of your saved data in case of console failure or console upgrade, requires paying for PS Plus Essentials. This is free on Xbox. PlayStation asks customers to pay upgrade fees for the same game when played on PlayStation 5 over PlayStation 4. Xbox, free of charge. I could go on, but I'm sure the CMA can do an analysis of PlayStation's market practices. Let's look at Xbox and ABK. One of the Xbox's continued failings is a lack of first-party content to compete with the stellar library of Nintendo and great studios and library of games on PlayStation. This is what Microsoft is trying to remedy to compete better in the gaming market. They have recently acquired several studios, a publisher in ZeniMax, and are now looking to acquire ABK. Getting into the specifics of ABK, for some reason, we need to talk about one game, Call of Duty, herein referred to as COD. Let's put this in different terms. Disney recently acquired Lucasfilm. Would a stipulation of that from regulators be that you must make Star Wars movies and put them in theaters? Does that seem like a reasonable thing to do? Call of Duty is a work of art, a game. A developer, creator of art can choose to, or not, make it. To assume Call of Duty, a video game, is akin to lumber, steel, or some other commodity is entirely absurd. Revenue from a game is irrelevant to the fact that an IP owner can choose whatever they want to do with their IP. Disney should not be forced to make a Marvel movie. They can choose to do so if they wish. Equivalently, Activision can choose to make COD or choose not to. One game does not topple the gaming industry, just as one movie doesn't topple the movie industry. Just because Sony is used to raking in a % of the revenue from COD doesn't mean it will always be made, and is something Sony should in any way expect or force to be made. Reading through most of the Phase 1 analysis, I'm left disappointed, listening to entirely farcical arguments from Sony on why this one game will end them is entirely ridiculous. Nintendo survived Sony's onslaught on them, and COD, or any of the other AAA games, aren't on their platform. This also ignores the fact that there are over a dozen games with higher monthly active users than COD, like Fortnite and PUBG. The assumption that one game is the gaming industry is really a stunning claim. Regardless of whether COD even continues as a franchise, stays multiplat, or becomes exclusive to Game Pass, it won't destroy the gaming world. If Sony feels it can't compete without COD, how did they manage the PlayStation and PlayStation 2, the top-selling console of all time, without COD? As a multiplayer game, COD, assuming it continues to be made, is better served being on as many platforms as possible. Microsoft and ABK have already stated this to the CMA, and yet this has been ignored. Again, it is irrelevant if COD continues to be released at all, let alone on PlayStation. It is not the CMA's job to save the Sony monopoly in console gaming. It is, in fact, to find ways to regulate or eliminate the PlayStation monopoly. A competitor willing to try to do that, offering cheaper prices, better value, more options to access their content, and a better ecosystem should be a welcome sight to regulators looking to thwart an existing monopoly. This does not mean there shouldn't be scrutiny. There should be. Microsoft is halfway playing the same game Sony did to take over the market. The question is, what should the industry look like? Should the Sony model be the standard? Is it time for legislation over the largest entertainment market? Would it be more beneficial to have some regulations on how content can be locked or not from competitors, especially third-party games? These questions should be answered by legislation across the world, as we finally recognize that this market shouldn't be ignored. No one was there to help or even care when the console world was destroyed by Sony in the 1990s. Perhaps it's time this industry was treated as more than just an afterthought. I am still in favor of letting Microsoft try to compete with Sony by acquiring ABK, and possibly more in areas of weakness in their lineup, like Asian content. And yes, this absolutely means taking away market share from PlayStation. That's the whole point. Someone needs to compete with them to bring choice to consumers. In most of the world, it's PlayStation or nothing. That needs to change. More competition would be even better, but we can't force others to enter the market. I would expect companies like Amazon and Apple will attempt to come into this market, and they are taking small steps towards that. It is unknown how this will go in the future. A better ultimate destination is having studios and publishers making their games available standalone through the stores available on your endpoints, your mobile devices, your TVs, etc. This eliminates the console platform question. For example, Ubisoft can just make their games available to consumers via a store on your TV, or their subscription service. In this model, the competitive landscape would change dramatically, allowing content creators to directly interact with their customers. Though this is a possibility, the current market is still locked down by platforms, and Sony is the leader of it. Sony also has a lock on AAA content on consoles, to the point of market monopolization. I look forward to your analysis of this market and whether you will recognize the dominance Sony has over it at this time. Thank you for your time. Well, that was what I sent to the CMA. Now let's look at the EU. They had similar concerns to the CMA, but added a potential for Windows competitors to not have access to, again, Call of Duty, as if this is one game, if this one game, a work of art, is somehow the backbone of any platform in gaming. Firstly, Windows is already a monopoly in desktop OS. That ship has sailed. The main competitor, OS X, does not have a dominant enough market share, but it has been able to erode some market share away from Windows. This is kind of an odd area to look at, as ABK doesn't put COD on OS X. It isn't being taken away, it never existed there. Not sure why they even brought this up. Ignorance maybe, I'm not sure. But in any case, COD isn't what makes or breaks the platform. Steam lost access to COD for years. And lo and behold, they didn't fold shop. In fact, the opposite happened. COD is now back on Steam because it was better for business to have it there. Most of the other points from the CMA apply here as well. In the EU, Sony enjoys 85+% market share and is absolutely a de facto monopoly. I hope the EU learns from this process that they have some work to do in this market to make things better. Thanks, and I'll catch you guys next time.